1933, the decision to join the Royal Tank Corps was made. For Bill Close, this was less a patriotic calling and more an escape. He was fleeing the suffocating reality of the Great Depression. With civilian career prospects non-existent, the military offered a powerful lure. It promised adventure and, crucially, steady pay. The Corps began its transformation of raw, desperate young men into soldiers. This process started at Bovington Camp. It was a relentless, grinding regimen under the harsh tutelage of instructors like Sergeant Lemon. The goal was to instill discipline and a semblance of order where only desperation had existed before. For 6 years, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment existed in the tense static peace of the phony war. That illusion shattered abruptly on September 3, 1939. The unit, now a fighting force, was plunged into the early disasters of the conflict. None was more chaotic than the hasty deployment to Calais in May 1940. The deployment of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was a masterpiece of organisational failure. Troops felt immediately unwanted upon arrival. They stepped off pleasure steamers into a maelstrom of confusion. The logistical foresight was non-existent. Vital war material was loaded haphazardly. Heavy tanks were buried deep in the holds of vessels like the City of Christchurch. This forced agonising delays during unloading under mounting enemy fire. Compounding the chaos were conflicting and last-minute orders from BEF command. Colonel Keller was visibly irritated as he attempted to impose order where little existed. Poor intelligence meant the BEF walked straight into the guns of heavily armed German forces. These included the formidable 10th Panzer Division. The transition from peacetime soldiering to combat was brutally swift. Visceral fear took hold as bullets cracked on the cobbles around reconnaissance patrols. The inadequacy of their equipment sealed their fate. A10 tanks lacked high-explosive rounds. This rendered them useless against German anti-tank guns. Initial hope for swift evacuation turned into a desperate order to defend. The garrison held out long enough to perhaps influence Hitler's decision to halt the panzers at Dunkirk. The cost was total. As Calais fell on May 26th, the narrator's final act was setting fire to his Daimler Dingo scout car. This vehicle was ideal for reconnaissance, but was now useless. He escaped under a hail of shellfire. The unit had been gutted, losing nearly half its strength and all its vehicles. The subsequent campaigns in Greece and Crete in 1941 underscored that the systemic failures of 1940 had not been learned. The deployment of 15-ton A10 tanks into the challenging, unsuitable mountainous terrain was immediately hampered. Logistical oversights included the near-freezing conditions. These conditions were exacerbated by an engine driver's failure to understand the importance of tea for tank crews. The ultimate betrayal came with the spare parts. They were sent for A15 and A13 models. They were useless for the A10s. The realization brought a stunned silence to the mechanics. The tanks were now irrecoverable junk. The German invasion initiated a rapid and brutal 300-mile retreat toward Thermopylae. For 3 days and nights, the tank crews endured a harrowing flight. This flight was marked by burning villages and endless streams of refugees. The column included ox carts, mules, and people. Dead civilians often outnumbered dead soldiers. Air attacks by relentless Stukas turned the convoy into a grotesque spectacle. Burning lorries tumbled down slopes. Temperatures plummeted. Crews bivouacked in snow holes, maintaining a monotonous mountain vigil. Near Argos, the protagonist encountered the heartbreaking reality of inevitable defeat. The gunner major and 300 men were preparing for an orderly surrender. Driven by a primal refusal to quit, the narrator stated plainly, "I don't know for certain what I'm going to do, but I'm not staying here." He continued his escape. His solitary journey led him to Athens. He navigated suspicion and indifference before finding unexpected camaraderie. He found an escape route in a brothel in the red light district. His final hope rested on the Popeye Veronica. This was a dilapidated vessel, skippered by a man known only as Blackbeard. The ship was a catalogue of failure, featuring leaking tanks and engine troubles. It had a maximum speed of 3.5 knots. After encountering a German submarine and enduring intense air attacks, they were forced to burn parts of the ship itself for fuel. They needed this fuel just to keep moving. They ultimately evacuated to Crete. They were utterly stripped of their armour. They retained only their cap badges as proof of the tanks they once commanded. By the time the unit reformed in Egypt, the 3rd RTR had suffered catastrophic losses of both personnel and equipment. These back-to-back disasters, Calais, Greece, and Crete, served as a harsh, bloody lesson. The unit was forced into a complete reorganization. They began receiving the American M3 Honey Stuart tanks. The immediate future of the British armoured forces hinged on whether they could achieve technological and tactical parity. They faced the rapidly advancing and increasingly formidable German Afrika Korps. The North African campaign became the crucible where the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment was forged anew. It forced the British military to confront a technological and tactical parity they had utterly lacked in 1940. The German Afrika Korps had not merely pushed the British back, they had introduced weaponry that immediately rendered older British tanks obsolete. The famed Matilda, once deemed invincible, was shattered by the long-range accuracy of the German 88mm anti-aircraft gun. This gun was repurposed to devastating effect. It was engaging targets from well over 1,000 yards. British tanks, still hampered by their 2-pounder and 40mm guns, found their penetration and accuracy diminishing rapidly beyond 500 yards. Amidst this disparity, the arrival of American armour was a lifeline. The M3 Honey Stuart was fast and low profile. It was excellent for reconnaissance. However, its 37mm gun offered marginal fighting capacity. The true technological advantage came with the General Grant tank. Its massive profile was a drawback, yet the forward-facing 75mm Sponson gun provided the crucial weight of fire needed to counter the panzers. It was capable of outshooting everything the Germans had, save for the omnipresent 88mm. That technology alone could not conquer the desert. Operations like Battle Axe and Crusader devolved into chaotic whirlpool battles that chewed up men and machines. The fluid battle lines led to paralyzing confusion and frequent friendly fire incidents. The logistical demands of the new equipment were relentless. The Honeys, for instance, required refueling every 40 miles. The 4th Armoured Brigade entered Operation Crusader with 160 Honeys. The 22nd Armoured Brigade lost half its strength at Bir el Gubi. The desert became a grim spectacle of destruction. It was a sordid cemetery of motionless wrecks, lorries, and gun-towing vehicles. The brutality of attrition warfare tested the limits of human endurance. The unrelenting cycle of dry heat, freezing nights, sudden storms, and constant threat led to severe physical ailments. These included desert sores and crippling sunburn. The profound psychological strain was undeniable. Experienced crews were decimated, and the strain led to undeniable burnout. The pressure was so intense that instances of outright refusal to fight emerged, such as Gillespie's mutiny. The scale of the German response was demonstrated starkly at Gazala. The 3rd RTR faced an overwhelming armoured thrust of 200 German tanks. In a critical defensive action on the Gazala Ridge, the Grants proved their worth. Unleashing concentrated fire, they inflicted heavy losses on the advancing panzers. They forced the Germans to pay a horrific price for ground gained. The author's own tank was hit, forcing him to bail out. Yet he immediately took command of a new tank, alias Eddie Sautel. This was a necessary reflex in a campaign where leadership was constantly being killed off. This constant, immediate demand for experienced command drove a fierce wartime meritocracy. In March 1942, Bill Close, a seasoned enlisted man who had survived the crucible of the early war, received an immediate commission. His progression from sergeant to major within a year underscored the reality of the Desert War. Only those who had survived the most intense combat, those who had been shot out, were truly fit to lead. This was the antithesis of the perceived growth industry of staff officers back in Cairo. The desert demanded leaders who knew the difference between theory and the visceral reality of a shell cracking against armor plate. The campaign reached its decisive climax in 1943. Following the massive barrage at El Alamein, the 8th Army began its long pursuit. This pursuit culminated in the Mareth Line. After initial frontal assaults failed against entrenched enemy positions, the strategic left hook maneuver was launched. This involved 27,000 men and 6,000 vehicles moving under the cover of darkness. These night moves were a nightmare for tank crews. They navigated treacherous terrain with no lights and maintained absolute radio silence. The fighting at Mareth was desperate. The concerted division attack on March 26 saw tanks advancing in a manner described as balaclava fashion. They followed the barrage and encountered brutal resistance. It was here that the unique, shared culture of the Tank Corps was illuminated. Troop Sergeant Geordie Rie, soon to receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal, articulated an unwritten rule of the desert. Upon seeing enemy crews bailing out of a burning tank, he told his gunner to cease firing. He stated simply that machine gunning them was not done. The fighting spirit was personified by officers like Squadron Commander Bob Crisp. Before being dismissed, Crisp told Close, "Look after the squadron, Bill. I won't be long." This summed up the duality of the campaign, featuring brilliant action at the front and complicated politics in the rear. Bill Close took command of the squadron after his commander was wounded at Mareth. They led the unit through the final, grinding stages of the campaign. This culminated in the surrender of the 90th Light and the remnants of the Afrika Korps in May 1943. The decisive victory was a testament to the combined arms approach, the tenacity of the troops, and the eventual technological parity achieved. With the desert campaign concluded, the exhausted troops were granted a necessary respite. Bill Close, recovering from a leg burn sustained during the Mareth offensive, was sent to a luxurious hospice in Cairo. This was a stark country club contrast to the front. It offered excellent food and accommodation. It also featured weekly special dinner dances attended by chosen Egyptian lovelies. The transition from the grim reality of the desert to the opulence of Cairo leave was jarring but necessary. Soon, the 3rd RTR would be called upon to face the next, and arguably more brutal, chapter of the war. This chapter was the hedgerows of northwest Europe. The transfer from the vast, unforgiving expanses of the North African desert to the claustrophobic hedgerow-choked fields of Normandy was a jarring, brutal transition. Landing in France in June 1944, the 3rd RTR, now equipped with Sherman tanks, faced an entrenched enemy. This enemy was not merely tenacious but technologically superior. The open desert had offered visibility and room to maneuver, despite its dangers. Normandy's dense bocage country provided the Germans with ideal defensive terrain. It transformed every sunken lane and high bank into a potential ambush point. The psychological shift was profound. The desert had allowed for a certain grim chivalry, like the unwritten rule against machine-gunning bailing crews. That decency was gone. It was replaced by the desperate focus on survival in a landscape where death could spring from any concealed position. Every advance was a high-stakes gamble. The heavy losses suffered by units like the 12th RTR in Tunisia had already underscored the terrifying effectiveness of the enemy's new armor. This included the particularly deadly Tiger tank. The Sherman 75mm gun, while a marked improvement over earlier British armament, was largely ineffective against the Tiger's thick frontal armor. The British forces were playing catch-up. They relied on the heavier-hitting Firefly variant, mounting the 17-pounder gun to achieve any form of parity. Early strategic errors exacerbated the technological disadvantage. Commanders still clinging to outdated doctrines often deployed tanks in penny packets. These were piecemeal attacks that allowed the Germans to concentrate their fire and destroy isolated units efficiently. Poor intelligence regarding the depth and strength of German defenses, especially around critical positions like Hill 112, turned initial assaults into costly, bloody fiascos. Despite the grim prospects and the evident difficulty of the fighting, the spirit of the 3rd RTR remained intact. The persistent, insidious myth that there had been mutinous feelings within the regiment while stationed in Aldershot was vehemently untrue. It was deeply resented by the men who had endured Calais, Greece, and the desert. Their determination was fierce, though tempered by a realism born of combat experience. They understood the cost. They pushed forward under the command of Lieutenant Colonel David Silvertop, whose courage and ability were never in doubt. The culmination of these early, grinding battles was Operation Goodwood, launched on July 18, 1944. The sheer scale of the initial preparation was meant to guarantee success. The overwhelming air and artillery barrage that commenced that morning created a false, dangerous sense of security. The ground shook, and the air was thick with smoke. This led many to believe that the German resistance had been utterly neutralized. Could anyone truly believe the Germans were broken, as the optimism dissolved within hours? As the armored columns advanced, they ran headlong into an enemy that, though battered, was far from broken. German resilience was shocking. Villages like Kangi and Grenteville, which should have been smoking ruins easily bypassed, had been transformed into nests of concealed anti-tank defences. The formidable 88mm guns, along with well-hidden Panther tanks, opened fire at point-blank range. They scythed through the advancing Shermans. Without adequate infantry support, a critical strategic failure, the tanks were naked. They were vulnerable to close-range attacks and ambushes. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The author's own squadron, leading the charge, was devastated. It lost 17 tanks out of 19. The 8th Corps suffered the loss of over 400 tanks in the operation. The high casualties were compounded by the difficulty of the terrain. The tanks formed up on the start line in full view of the enemy. This was a vulnerability the Germans exploited ruthlessly. The fighting on Borgebus Ridge became a desperate, terrifying melee. The psychological toll was reflected in the requests of some senior sergeants to be released from tank duties. They were unable to endure the constant, immediate threat of being trapped in a burning hull. The harsh lessons of Goodwood forced a fundamental and immediate re-evaluation of armoured doctrine.
The war could not be won by tanks alone.
The only way to survive the bocage was through the necessary integration of infantry directly onto the tanks. This was the combined arms approach. The infantry, particularly men like Noel Bell of the 8th Rifle Brigade, were essential for clearing the hidden bazooka men. They were needed to identify anti-tank positions before they could engage. This adaptation, born in the inferno of the Caen battles, would define the success of the subsequent rapid breakout across France. Despite the immense tactical cost, Operation Goodwood achieved its primary strategic objective. The massive British assault successfully drew the bulk of German panzer divisions eastward. This fatally weakened the German line in the west. This allowed the American forces launching Operation Cobra to punch through the thinly held defences. It initiated the breakout that would ultimately lead to the closure of the Falaise Gap and the headlong race towards the Seine. The sacrifices made by the 3rd RTR and the 11th Armoured Division in the hell of the Norman hedgerows had purchased the strategic freedom required for overall Allied victory in the region. The exploitation phase of the Northwest Europe campaign was defined by speed. It was a frantic, grueling race that saw the 11th Armoured Division cover 386 miles in just 8 days. This headlong rush through France and Belgium was a testament to overwhelming Allied operational capability. It exploited German disorganization and accelerated the collapse of their front. The capture of vital targets like Amiens and Antwerp secured crucial ports. This solved immense logistical bottlenecks. As Bertha, the momentum could not last forever. As the British forces pushed deeper into Germany, the resistance, though localized, hardened. The fighting devolved into a series of costly, desperate struggles against a determined enemy. Their lines of supply were broken, but their will to fight remained intact. Every canal, every river, every crossroads became a defensive position. This turned the advance into a nightmare of destroyed bridges and mined roads. The specialized equipment, like the Sherman tank fitted with a bulldozer blade, was essential just to clear the path. Its call sign was George George. The strategic imperative to secure crossings led to moments of intense, singular bravery. At the canal near Eversheide, a critical bridge had been rigged with two 50-pound bombs as halted the division's advance. Under continuous enemy fire, Lieutenant Frank Wadsworth undertook the harrowing task of disarming the charge. Ignoring the snapping of bullets on the stonework around him, Wadsworth crept forward and, with steady hands, cut the wires. It was a high-tension, lonely act that secured a vital bridgehead for the entire division and earned the Military Cross. The fighting only intensified as the 3rd RTR pressed toward the River Aller. The terrain here was unforgiving. Marshy ground on either side of the river restricted movement. This forced the tanks onto a narrow axis of advance. They were, in effect, sitting targets. The brutality of the final engagements was immediate and shattering. Leading the advance, young Troop Commander John Pearson's tank was suddenly struck by an unseen anti-tank gun, and his army. This was followed instantly by Sergeant Cranston's. The destruction was total. Driver Manning was killed instantly. The operator and another crew member were badly burnt. Amidst the wreckage and chaos, Lieutenant Lomas embodied the sheer, raw tenacity demanded of tank commanders. His tank was hit not once, but twice. He continued to engage the hidden enemy position until his turret was completely demolished. It was a suicidal, relentless defense that bought the crucial minutes needed for the rest of the squadron to maneuver. Then, the ultimate threat materialized: a Tiger tank. The formidable German heavy armor, with its near-impenetrable front and devastating 88mm gun, appeared ready to annihilate the reeling squadron. Sergeant Harding, however, had learned the lessons of North Africa and Normandy well. Exploiting a flank maneuver by supporting squadrons, he positioned his tank that delivered a perfect series of armor-piercing shots into the Tiger's vulnerable side. The behemoth brewed up immediately. It was a decisive moment of skill and firepower that averted further disaster. The war's trajectory shifted abruptly from combat to humanitarian catastrophe as the 3rd RTR continued its advance. Lieutenant Don Ricketts' leading troop approached a concentration camp near Belsen. The sensory reality of the place hit the soldiers first. The stench was indescribable. It was a suffocating miasma of death and disease. The sight was worse. Bodies lay everywhere, piled in ditches. Huts were filled with inmates who were almost naked, only just alive and pitifully thin. The horror was so profound, so utterly beyond the scope of warfighting, that the area was immediately declared a no-go zone. The military priority instantly changed from killing the enemy to containing a massive outbreak of disease and managing overwhelming human suffering. The official end of hostilities arrived with a strange, dull finality. Field Marshal Montgomery accepted the surrender of northern German forces. But even the surrender was not without its dramatic flourish. The final operation involved clearing a defiant SS unit. The SS colonel and his adjutant, riding on the front of the author's tank, surrendered in full dress uniform. They were impeccably turned out, as if for a parade inspection. Only after the author proved his field rank did the officers accept defeat. They represented the last vestiges of the Third Reich's military protocol at Tufka. For Bill Close, the war was over. His journey from a raw sergeant in the failed defense of Calais to a major commanding a squadron on the Elbe was complete. Though the promise of regular commissions for emergency commissioned officers would ultimately be unfulfilled, his decision to decline further short-service commissions marked a personal turning point. He left the 3rd RTR. The war had taken everything: men, machines, and innocence. But it had confirmed the enduring truth that victory belonged not to the side with the most advanced technology, but to the men who possessed the greatest courage, leadership, and camaraderie. The 3rd tanks, as one poem asserted, were often miles and miles ahead, doing the crucial, unheralded work that defined the bitter, grinding road to victory. The final German surrender brought a profound, unsettling anticlimax. The war did not conclude with the expected roar of triumph. It ended with a nervous silence, followed by the logistical grind of occupation and demobilization. For Bill Close, who had been a soldier since the depths of the Depression, the end of the fighting meant confronting the personal toll of surviving a relentless 7-year war. He was a statistical anomaly. He was a man who had climbed out of 11 separate burning tanks. This spanned from the chaos of Calais to the final desperate engagements near the Dortmund-Ems Canal, that last hit. A Panzerfaust strike on his Comet, just weeks before the armistice, epitomized the war's desperate finality. The earlier chivalry of the desert had long vanished. It was replaced by a universal, desperate focus on simply wanting to get safely through the final act. The immediate post-war period provided little respite. Close accepted a temporary assignment with the military government detachment in Kiel. This was a necessary buffer between the front line and the return to civilian life. But as the British Army began its rapid restructuring, a bitter reality set in for the men who had led from the turret. The wartime meritocracy that had elevated men like Close from sergeant to major without traditional officer training was deemed expendable. The promise of regular commissions for emergency commissioned officers, the unspoken contract for their sacrifices, was quietly shelved. It was a profound disillusionment for those who had proven their worth under fire. In October 1945, Close made his final personal turning point. He declined the offer of further short-service commissions. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, the unit that had defined his youth and his manhood, would continue without him. After 12 years, his military career was over. Yet the skills and discipline forged in the desert and the bocage would eventually guide him back to service with the RME, where he retired in 1962. But the legacy of the 3rd RTR, wearing of the green, persisted, often unacknowledged. The regiment had been the perpetual spearhead that was consistently thrown into the most chaotic and costly actions. These included the disaster at Calais, the retreat from Greece, the critical defensive actions at Gazala and Mareth, and the relentless speed of the advance across northwest Europe. Yet the narrative of the war often focused on other more publicly acclaimed regiments. This left the 3rd Tanks to occupy an essential but often unheralded space in history. This reality was captured in the bitter pride of the regimental poem. It asserted that the 3rd Tanks were often miles and miles ahead, doing the crucial, grinding work that few acknowledged. Decades later, reflecting on the war, Bill Close would stand watching modern military parades. He observed the sleek, highly advanced tanks and the impeccably turned-out soldiers of a new generation. The technology had evolved dramatically. The cumbersome, high-profile grants were replaced by low-slung, powerful machines. The logistics were streamlined into sterile efficiency. But the author knew, with the certainty of a man who had bailed out of 11 burning hulls, that the essential truth of warfare remained unchanged. Victory was not won by the caliber of the gun or the thickness of the armor. It was won by the human equation. It was determined by the fundamental qualities of leadership, the sheer, raw courage of the individual soldier, and above all, the fierce, unbreakable camaraderie among tank crews. That gritty human dimension of war, the bond forged in the heat of a burning tank, was the true determinant of victory. It was a constant truth that no amount of technological progress could ever supersede. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.